Hello everybody, I'm here to show you how to solder together your own Barnabas Noggin. I have in front of me all the parts you need to do so. I also have off to the side, off camera, I have my soldering iron. It's already plugged in, it's heated up. I've got some rosin core solder so that I don't need to use flux in addition to what I have. If you're not using rosin core solder and you need to have that flux, just keep that in mind that this tutorial is going to be a little different for you than it is for myself. All right, so without further ado, let's talk about all the parts we have here on camera. So first and foremost is the PCB board. This is the board we're going to be putting all of our electronics components on. And this is a Barnabas Noggin Rev C board. So it's just the third evolution of our board. So if you're watching this sometime in the future, you may have something along the lines of like a Rev D or a Rev E board. It shouldn't be too different. There's just like some minor differences in between all of the boards we have so far. So keep that in mind. We also have an Arduino Nano, which we're actually going to be soldering directly onto the board. This one already has all the headers pre-attached to it. If you're using one without the headers attached, that's also something you should keep in mind, that you're going to need to solder those headers onto your Nano separately. We have 4 1x3 pin headers. So these, I actually am short on 2x3 headers. I would prefer to just have 2 2x3 headers, but we're going to make do with this. I have 2 6-pin male to female pin headers, 2 8-pin female to male headers, our power supply, 2 15-pin female to male headers. We also have a voltage regulator because we typically use 9 volts. We use a 9-volt battery to plug into this, and we only want 5 of that voltage, so we have our voltage regulator. And then we have 6 really small capacitors here. It might be difficult to see them for what they are. These are actually capacitors. So I'm going to get some of this stuff out of the way and we can get started. So I typically start with the capacitors. So we have 6 capacitors here, and what I typically do is I do this a little differently than some people do. I'll show you both ways. So I'm just going to drop a capacitor on to the PCB board near one of the little places where it's supposed to go. So you're going to be soldering it directly on. You see right there you have one spot for one end of the capacitor and one for the other end of the capacitor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it right next to those guys right there where it's supposed to be. And I'm going to take my soldering iron and I'm going to put it on one of those little squares. And I'm going to give it a little bit of solder, and it's going to melt a little bit there. And I'm going to use this end of the solder to just kind of push it where it needs to be. And once I've done that and I can see that it's sticking to the solder, I'll go ahead and just lift my soldering iron away, allowing the solder there to harden. And then I'll just get the other side, which is a lot easier at this point. So this is how I do it. Now another method you can use involves a pair of tweezers. So what you have to do is get some solder on your iron tip beforehand, and then grab one of these guys. I'm going to like rotate this a little bit. Grab one of the capacitors with the tweezers. You want to kind of do the same thing. You want to hold your soldering iron over one of the little ports to put an end of the capacitor. And then just remove it like that. And then you can touch up the other end the same way. Where you just take like that. There we go. So whichever method you use, keep in mind that the soldering iron, when you remove the soldering iron, you're going to influence the capacitor a little bit, and you might get a little bit of tug, and it might be difficult to get to the capacitor to stay exactly where you want it to. So you're going to have to hold it in place while you're removing your soldering iron, however you choose to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the first method on the remaining three. Okay. Push this guy. All right, almost there. All right, so I'll give you a real quick close-up. So there's 4, there's the other 2 down there. All right, the next thing I want to solder in is I'm just going to take care of the last solder on piece, which is the voltage regulator. Now I handle the voltage regulator a lot in the way that I handle the capacitors, where I simply leave it in the area where it's supposed to be soldered onto. So you can see this little white square, and then you have some conducting, like a conducting rectangle just above it, or for you just below it, and then above it you have 3 little conducting squares there. So that's where that needs to be placed. So I'm going to put it like just below that big rectangle. And then I'm going to go ahead and put some solder on there, keeping the soldering iron on it the entire time. And then just remove it. Very good. And then these 3 legs here are much easier to get once you have the first part in. So there you go, just like that. So I've got the 6-pin and 8-pin headers here. I handle these a little differently than other people do as well. If you have one of those devices that has the little clamps and let you hold things in place while you solder, that might be helpful about now. I typically don't use those. I don't like them very much. So what I like to do is I will put all these headers in. And then I'll just kind of rotate this thing down, place it like that. And the important thing is you need to make sure that you get all of these headers to be aligned with each other. And you can actually pretty easily do that just by dragging it back and forth on your surface, whatever you're using. I have white paper over some cardboard just to prevent from ruining the table I'm working on. And once you do that, very carefully solder 1 pin of each header to somewhat secure it in place. Okay, I'm going to flip this over. So now that we've soldered 1 pin of each header, it's not going to fall off. And I like to do that to solder 1 pin from each header so that I can flip it over and check and make sure everything's aligned. And it's much easier to manipulate the way things are pointing when only 1 pin has been soldered as opposed to all of them. So this one actually looks pretty good. It looks pretty neatly aligned. So I'm just going to go ahead and solder the rest of the pins now. Now this board conducts very well, so I haven't had any real problems soldering these pin headers on, and I don't intend to through any of this. Actually, most of the surfaces conduct very well. Okay, almost done. All right, last one. All right, what do you guys think of my handiwork? Not bad? All right. So the next thing I'm going to tackle are these 2x3 pin headers, which, once again, if you remember, I only have the 1x3 headers. I would really prefer to use the 2x3 headers, but I don't have any at the moment. So I'm just going to kind of use these guys. It's more or less the same thing. Is he sticking out for some reason? Okay, well, we'll see. And once again, this is how I choose to handle these guys. There are probably easier / better ways to do it. And actually one of the 1x3s fell out, so I'm going to have to solder that guy in separately. Once again, the surface is conducting very well. Uh-oh, he's misaligned, so I'm just going to kind of drag it along the paper while I have the soldering iron touching to keep the solder hot, and that gets him to be realigned. Alright, so I only have one pin soldered from each of these headers. Okay. And once again, I'm going to kind of look at these, see if I like the way they're aligned. I think I could do a slightly better job, so I'm just going to kind of realign with my hands. Still pretty flexible because I only have the one pin soldered in. And then I'm just going to go to town on the rest. All right, so those are in nice and solid now. The board's starting to shape up. Next, we're going to use these 15-pin female to male headers. So once again, I'm just going to use my method of doing this. So one at a time, trying to keep them nice and aligned. Okay. You notice I paused there before flipping it over. I just want to make sure the solder is dried. Otherwise, I'll end up with the part, the solder drying with the part kind of half out when I lift it. And that's kind of a pain to deal with. So that's what we got so far. So there's only a couple pieces left actually. So next I'm going to use the diode. And notice on the board, right there, the diode is telling you which direction it should be placed. So I'm going to place the end with the little gray stripe, hopefully in the correct direction, like that, and push it downwards. Okay, and then I will kind of flex the legs out on the other side to keep it from falling through. And then just solder those legs in. And this is very convenient because if you end up globbing too much solder on, you can just walk the solder up the legs and then cut them off with your wire cutters. All right, so I just got a pair of wire cutters. We're going to cut those down to size. So this piece is a little interesting, but I'm going to handle it more or less in the same way I've been handling all the other pieces. I'm going to put my soldering iron on the piece and also touching the conducting area around the piece. And then I'm just going to kind of feed the solder in so that like all the surfaces are touching. So the solder is touching the conducting surface around it, as well as touching the part, as well as touching the soldering iron. Oh, that could use a little more solder. And you can see we've got a nice solid connection there like that. I'm just going to do the same for the others. And there we go. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and attach the Arduino Nano. Okay. So a couple of pointers, a couple of things to consider as you're going through this. You want to avoid making any soldering bridges across any of your pins. So for example, if you glob too much solder on, you might have this pin conducting with this pin. So you want to avoid doing that. And that's really easy. You can just kind of take your soldering iron and rake between the two pins in that area you want that solder to be gone. Also, something you want to do in post soldering is scrub your board with rubbing alcohol. So even though I haven't used the usual flux that you use when you're soldering, because I'm using rosin core solder, I can still get some flux kind of caked onto the board, and if I don't clean it, it can potentially conduct current across pins where I don't want it to do that. So I can still end up with more or less a bridge, and I get a short in my circuit. And you'll notice this if your board is working for a little while, it's taking code, it's accepting code, it's doing what you ask it to do, and then all of a sudden, maybe like an hour into it, it's not accepting any more code. You're having issues getting it to do simple tasks like blink LEDs and things like that. That kind of tends to be a problem with too much flux being on the board. So make sure you scrub it. Other than that, just remember to be safe. Soldering irons are dangerous. I've burned myself numerous times using them. Nothing too bad, luckily, but it's recommended that you solder in a well-ventilated area because it will produce fumes. Also use eye protection, wear some goggles, because that's easily the most dangerous or the worst mishap you can have with soldering iron is burning your eyeballs. Not pleasant. So just keep that in mind. If you end up with a couple second-degree burns on your hands, you know, you're one of us now. All right, you guys. Enjoy putting together your boards. I'll see you next time.